Okay. Okay, so continue with the theme of davening. And just before I read the sources of the information, one shouldn't talk one should try not to talk at all in shul, especially when someone's saying Kaddish during the repetition and the Torah reading. And even between aliyot of the Torah reading, one should, I know sometimes I try to avoid it. And you also can't, while you're doing your Amidah, you can't just start ask someone a question or stop. Okay, I also need to always keep this in mind. So anyway, it says here, one shouldn't interrupt the Amidah, neither for Kaddish, nor for Kedusha, but rather he should keep silent and concentrate on what the Shaliach Tzibur is saying. And it will be as if he had answered to Kaddish or Kedusha. If he was standing and saying the Amidah and they called him up to the reading of the Torah, he should not interrupt. They'll find someone else, they'll see. Okay, then we discussed that the other day. You can't stop halfway, you have to complete it. Okay, and it says for Kaddish, an interruption means saying Amen Yeheshme Rabbah Muvarach. And the same also, interruption also says Baruch Hu, which obviously you're not. If you're in the middle of your Amidah, you don't stop. You can pause and listen, wait for them to do the Kaddish or Kedusha, but you don't answer. Then you just continue once they're finished. And don't look up. Look at the book, because if you look up, they might call you up to the Torah. Just practically, keep on looking at the book. That's what I would do. And it says he should keep silence until Yisparach. That's the word begin the paragraph, the Kaddish immediately after Yeheshme Rabbah. And it will be as if he answered for the purpose of fulfilling the obligation of Kaddish and Kedusha. Nevertheless, it is not considered an interruption if he doesn't say anything. Okay, then it says he should not interrupt. We'll finish with this. If he didn't interrupt for being called to the Torah, and also if he interrupted for Kaddish or Kedusha, then he is considered like one who deliberately spoke during the Amidah. And according to the opinion of those rabbis, that in the case of deliberately speaking, he should go back to the beginning of the Amidah and start from scratch. But if he believes that it is permitted to interrupt for Kaddish, then he is like one who speaks unintentionally and need not go back to the beginning, as mentioned above. Okay, that's giving a bit of a leniency, but rather don't. But if they called him to the reading of the Torah and was standing at the point just after the Amidah, even if he had not yet started in the Natzor, which is the last paragraph, he should interrupt and go up for the reading of the Torah, but should be careful first to say beforehand. Okay. And you can actually, if you reach a certain point towards the end, the last two paragraphs, you can actually, one would have to look at the text. I don't want to tell you guys and be wrong with it, but you can. There is a point where you can actually answer towards the end of the Amidah, then continue and finish.
Okay.
Answer Kedusha. I'm not sure about Kaddish stuff. Anyway.
Okay. Well, thanks, Kev. Really, thank you very much. Kabb, are you off?
No, I'm on. Can you not see me?
No, we can't.
Okay, I can hear you. I'm trying to work it out, but I'll get there. Don't
there
worry.
Can only be one author with the screen off.
Arthur's on.
I've offended Arthur.
Arthur, stop it now, Arthur.
Arthur. Stop it.
I'm asking, is that better?
No, we love your face.
I don't know how to get the G. Okay, I can come back now?
Yes, we love
you guys see me now?
That's why we miss you. Yes, we can see you. All right. Guys, let's get started quickly.
Bad, but I am up.
Let's get started. So listen, just
one thing quickly, Damon. Once in this week's parsha coming up, every single thing we've done to now recently is in this parsha about all the damages and if the ox goes on the fire. It's unbelievable. I would do it today.
True. That's actually true. Maybe you can go
through
some of those.
Parshat Mishpatim.
I know. Maybe you can go through some of those laws in the parsha just as an exception this week. It's quite a nice to do that.
I'll do that.
Quite nice for Mishpatim. All right. So, guys, just quickly, we learned about there's a twofold payment for everything animate and inanimate, living and non-movable, etc. And as far as the theft of those things are concerned, there is a twofold payment. Because we say it's all inclusive of a myriad of articles, both living and movable. And then we say the fourfold and fivefold payment is not as inclusive because it's only the fourfold for a sheep and a fivefold for an ox. So that's fairly clear. So we learned, if you remember last time in Shemot chapter 22, verse 6, it says if the article was stolen from the house of the man, meaning the owner. So if a thief steals from a thief, he doesn't have to pay the twofold payment. He just has to pay the primary amount of what was stolen back to the homeowner himself. And there was an argument between the Kitsos HaChoshen, who said that one who steals a stolen article from a thief is not deemed a thief altogether, that he's not liable even for the value of the article itself, if the article is no longer extant, meaning if the article has been destroyed or it's no longer in existence, he doesn't have to replace it with money. But the Chazon Ish doesn't hold like that. He said, look, the fact that the Mishnah maintains that that the second thief is exempt from the twofold and fourfold and fivefold payment is the fact that it makes mention of that is indicative of the fact that it's implying that he's liable for the article itself. So in other words, if the article itself ends up being destructed, he has to pay the principal amount back, but he doesn't have to pay the what do you call it, the twofold payment or the fourfold or fivefold. So that's the issue between the knas, the penalty. So that's the difference between the Chazon Ish and the Kitsos HaChoshen. Now it says, right, because it talks about from the home of the man. So it says, well, what about a custodian? And it says, look, a custodian is different because a custodian gets permission to work as a representative of the owner. He's got a power of attorney. In other words, he can even consecrate it or he can sell it on the owner's behalf. So we're saying, well, is there a twofold or fourfold or fivefold payment if the custodian has ended up lying? Because remember, an unpaid custodian, if he takes an oath, is off the hook because he doesn't have to pay back for theft if somebody stole it from him, because he's doing the owner a favor. So he's not going to want to do the owner a favor for free if he's going to be liable for any theft or loss. But he does have to take a shavua, and in those days, people were very scared of using Hashem's name in vain. I wish they had that sort of fear today. They don't. And therefore, that would get him off the hook. But if you had some sociopathic person that actually claimed he didn't steal it, and there were witnesses afterwards that proved the fact that he took a false oath, he would obviously have to pay. But the question arises, is he then liable for the fourfold and fivefold payment since he's liable for the twofold payment? Okay. Now, you remember, not last daf, but the daf before, it talked about being, because he has to pay a twofold payment, he's more stringent than a paid custodian and unpaid custodian. And it ended up being nonsense because it's not more stringent. He's paying more money because he was caught lying. But if he wasn't, he wouldn't have to pay for theft or loss, whereas the paid custodian would have to. Only gets off for a unavoidable mishap or accident. So what we're saying is, if there are fourfold and fivefold payments required, if there's a twofold payment. So it says, because the fourfold, was their question, because the fourfold and fivefold payment applies only to the actual thief alone, and maybe it doesn't apply to somebody that had permission originally from the owner. In other words, the Torah teaches that an unpaid custodian swears that the deposit was stolen from him. Okay, and it has to. The reason it needs a separate commandment from the Torah, because remember we learned that in Shemot chapter 22 verse 6. Now it's dealing with Shemot chapter 22 still, but it goes to the verse 6 and 8. Now, why is there an extra mention in this Gemara? Because logic would have told you, maybe in a case where somebody had no permission to steal, they're obligated to the twofold and fourfold and fivefold payment. But when they have permission from the owner as power of attorney and legal guardianship, if they're caught lying, all they have to do is return the original article, the value sum. But we learn, no, you can't use the logic of that because, again, they're no different to a normal thief, and the owner trusted them. But just because the owner trusted them didn't mean they behaved any better than a normal thief. And in that particular case, they're liable for the twofold payment. That's true. But we needed this extra scriptural verse to include that even when originally it had the custodian had the owner's permission, and he got the article lawfully, subsequently he doesn't retain it lawfully if he's caught lying and the owner thought it was actually stolen from him. Okay. Now, one thing that we've got to work out is there liability for a fourfold or fivefold payment? Because it only mentions the twofold payment, not the fourfold or fivefold. So Rav Chia bar Abba said, in the name of Rav Yochanan, one who is custodian and claims a claim of theft by thief with respect to a deposit that was entrusted to him for safekeeping, when in fact he stole it himself and he was caught up by witnesses, he pays the twofold payment. And if he subsequently slaughtered or sold it, he pays the fourfold or fivefold payment. So what it's saying is that this scriptural passage refers in the preceding case that that basically it's a given. It's almost a fact that if you're required to pay a knas, as Gavin says, a penalty for the twofold payment, then obviously there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to pay for the fourfold or fivefold payment as well. It's logical deduction. It's almost a given. Now the Gemara, so that's the first version of it, that it's a given. It's a rule. Now the second version is saying, look, Rav Chia bar Abba said in the name of Rav Yochanan that it's possible that he would have to pay the fourfold and fivefold payment. Because the logic is one who is a custodian and claims a claim of theft by thief with respect to a deposit that was entrusted to him for safekeeping, when in fact he stole it himself, pays the twofold payment, and if he subsequently slaughtered it or sold it, obviously talking about a sheep and an ox, he pays the fourfold and fivefold payment. So the second one is almost a suggestion, and the first one is inferred as conclusive proof. But whatever method you wish to propose it, the Gemara doesn't agree with either of it, because it says, look, it's not a proof, because the Gemara rejects the proof. It says, does it state in the Mishnah there's no difference between the twofold and the fourfold and fivefold payment, other than that the twofold payment applies to living and inanimate objects? Okay? Why it states merely the rule of the twofold payment is more inclusive, hence it is possible that the Tana taught only one of the several differences between the twofold and the fourfold and fivefold payments and omitted the others. So I'll tell you what it's saying here is, look, the first one indicates that if you look at what is stolen, it talks about inanimate and living objects. So that is more inclusive of different range of things that will be stolen, okay? Now, it's saying here that maybe it's more inclusive, not only of what was stolen in terms of the twofold payment, but maybe who stole it. Meaning it's including both the thief and the custodian who lawfully got it originally and then claimed it was stolen from him. So therefore, the twofold payment applies to them, but maybe the fourfold or fivefold payment that's not as inclusive doesn't include a custodian that originally got it lawfully. Does that make sense? So there's two parts of the inclusiveness. The Gemara is basically saying maybe it's not only about what was stolen, that more things are included, living and non-living, whereas the fourfold and fivefold payment you're paying on living creatures. But maybe it's also who stole it, meaning a broader range of theft you're covering for penalties of the twofold payment, including both the original thief that had no permission to have the article and the custodian that originally did, but then subsequently was caught lying and did in fact steal it. But maybe it's not as inclusive of the fourfold or fivefold payment. So all it's saying is Rav Chia Bar Abba's statement in the name of Rav Yochanan is not necessarily a proof. It's not saying that it's not, but it's not saying that that's a foregone conclusion and a proof. Okay, so that's where we got to last time. I don't know if you guys appreciated a summary or not really.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, firstly,
Thank you.
I want to just thank Arthur for coming. I know you're not feeling well, mate, and may Hashem bless you with the proper health. I hope your back makes a recovery. I hope you can get it sorted out soon. I know you were looking to do it on Friday. I really know, but I just hope that you don't need surgery and it just needs a bit of resting time, and that you make a full recovery.
Amen.
Amen.
Also,
Amen.
I wish that this also is a recovery for the Moritz child that was 15 or 16 that was obviously had an accident and was dunked by a wave and is in a serious condition in terms of neck trauma and being able to use his arms and his legs. And please God, he makes a full recovery as well.
Really. I mean, also, Damon, Gavin, do you know, can I mention another lady's name? He's
yes.
Also a serious.
The one with
do you know Michal, my cousin, Jonathan Kay's wife, Michal, Gavin, you know Michal?
Yeah, sure.
So she's got a friend, Haley, who's got a very serious illness. Do you know the story?
I know, but I know Haley. I know who she is. She's a taller girl.
She's, not in a good way. And it's,
what's wrong with her?
People are davening for her. I don't know if she's got a terminal illness or what the story is, but people must just daven for her. Like my cousin
please say her Hebrew name. Do you know it? I'd really appreciate it. What is her Hebrew name?
I don't know her Hebrew name. No, I can get it.
Okay, let's wait to
get it to her. Just post it to the group, so I'll daven for her. And also, if you can post your nephew's friend as well, Damon, this guy.
Okay.
Just to the group, so I can daven tomorrow for him. All right.
Amen. All right.
Yeah. And keep davening every day until hopefully something's sorted.
Yeah.
100%. All right, so guys, let's go to what we're dealing with now. Now, the Gemara cites a clause of the Mishnah which states, for the rule of twofold payment applies, etc. In other words, it's talking about living things and inanimate things. So the Gemara is now going to identify the biblical source for the ruling. Where in the Chumash are these things known? Okay? And if you remember in the Chumash, in other words, basically it's saying, how do we derive the exact scope of the twofold payment from Scripture? That's the way that the Rashba puts it across. So, the rabbis taught in a brisa regarding the twofold penalty payment. The Torah first states for any matter of liability. Now, guys, you must remember this is Chazorah, this particular part. We've done it in a daf before, where it talks about Shemot chapter 22, verse 8. So the verse ostensibly refers to the twofold payment that's imposed upon the unpaid custodian who claims falsely under oath that goods entrusted to him were stolen, when in fact he took it for himself. So there's some items for which the twofold payment must be made, and there's a humanatic principle. Remember, Kevin read them to us in basically in the Siddur, and one of them is klal uprat over klal. Arthur, do you remember what that term means?
Macro.
Perfect. Macro, micro, macro. Excellent. Generalization, specification, and another generalization. Okay? So in other words, if you read the passage in its entirety, it says, if a man shall give money or utensils to his fellow to safeguard, and it is stolen from the house of the man, if the thief is found, he shall pay double. If the thief is not found, then the householder shall approach the court, that he did not lay his hand upon the fellow's property. Now, when we say the householder, we're obviously talking about the custodian. For any matter of liability, for an ox, for a donkey, for a sheep, for a garment, for any lost article about which he says, this is it. To the judges shall come both their claims. Whoever the judges find guilty shall pay the twofold payment to his fellow. So whenever it starts off with the term for any matter of liability, if I say your insurance covers any matter of liability, is that a generalization or specification, guys? Guys, if I say for any matter of liability, is that general or specific?
General.
Absolutely. Any. For anything. That's general, exactly. So that's the generalization. Then the Torah, when the minute it states for an ox, a donkey, or sheep or garment, is that covering everything, or is it now getting specific?
That's specific.
Absolutely right, Arthur. So that's a prat. Okay, so we started with the clown, that's the prat. For a donkey, for a sheep, for a garment. Now, then the Torah concludes with a statement for any lost article. Now, what is that?
General again.
Exactly, a general statement again. It's a generalization. So now there's a rule. We've learned this, that the Torah states whenever there's a generalization, followed by a specification, followed by another generalization, you may expound the overall law to include only those things that are similar to the specification. In other words, upon occasion, the Torah is going to pronounce a law with a combination of general and specific terms. So it's going to first state the law in general and in an expansive way. Then it's going to be a restricted application of the rule, as you know, that what happens is that when you've got a general to a specific, then it sticks to the specific law. Okay? In other words, it says, we'll cover you for anything within the boundaries of South Africa. Then you know it's not counting any other country. So that's specific. But then when you go to another generalization to say, and also the Southern Hemisphere, for example, then we know that it doesn't only include South Africa, but it's not as generally broad as it originally was to include the Northern Hemisphere. So in this specific case, the restrictive is a general rule saying that basically in any matter of liability. Then in what it says when an ox, a donkey, etc., that's restrictive, then it's expansive to, not expensive, expansive, to say that it includes what do you call it? Any lost article. Okay, so the minute you've got that law, the final expansive statement is now serving to broaden the application of the law by degree, to include all cases that are similar to the case described in the specific statement, but not as broad as though there was no defining specificity at all. Does that make sense, guys? So let's remember what that was before. I'm sure it's going to come back to you. So it's stating here, just as the specified item is expressly something that is movable and has intrinsic value, so to anything else that is movable and has intrinsic value is subject to the law of the twofold payment. So obviously, if you say that it's movable, what does it exclude? Land, because land is not movable. It also excludes slaves, because it's exegetically compared to land, meaning from a legal point of view, in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 46, it states that non-Jewish slaves, and you shall bequeath them to your children after you as a holding to possess, meaning that it's almost inherited. So it's referred in terms of legal status as land. That's in Kedushin 22b. So obviously, that would be excluded, that you'd have to pay the twofold payment there for a slave that's kidnapped and stolen, I'm assuming. And that land can't be that you have to pay back the actual land plus double. And then legal documents are excluded. Why? Because a legal document, you might say, well, currency is worth money. But they say, like a promissory note or a check, even though it has a value of money, that's because we put a value to it. But we're not keeping it for the paper. So we're actually keeping it because they represent something. So it doesn't have intrinsic value. It's got extrinsic value, meaning the meaning we've attached to it, but not intrinsic in and of itself. So anything that's not movable like land, or legally considered like land, like a non-Jewish slave, or something that doesn't have intrinsic value like a promissory note, consecrated property is also excluded. Why? Because there's a statement between his fellow is written, which means a thief must pay the twofold payment if he steals it from his fellow Jew, but not from stealing consecrated property from the temple treasury, because it doesn't use the term as his fellow. So if you say that this law is expounded through the humanatic principle of generalization and specifications, you could say a different way. You could say just as the specified item is expressly something whose carcass transmits tumah through contact and carrying, the derivation would teach us to include anything else whose carcass transmits tumah through contact and carrying, but not birds. Guys, is this ringing a bell? It should. Guys, we've done this before. We dealt with the issue, Kevin, of a nevela, a carcass, and that basically any of the animals specified, like an ox, a donkey, a sheep, is ava tumah and transmits tumah to a person who touches it or carries it, or even without touching it directly. So those sort of animals, we're saying that the Torah mentions in their specification requires the twofold and fourfold payment. Well, we know in the case of an ox and a sheep, that's a fourfold payment. But even a donkey, which is a twofold payment, what have they got in common? They've got the fact that they are living creatures, they're movable, but their carcass is an avatuma when it's dead, meaning it contracts tumah even without touching it. Okay? So where's that principle of a nevela? Leviticus chapter 11, verse 24 to 28. And verse 39 to 40. So it talks about a behemoth. So any domestic species of animal or a chaya, which means a wild animal, transmits tumah to a person who either touches or carries it. So in the case of a non-kosher animal, that still applies to all carcasses. In kosher animals, it only applies when the animal dies without proper shechita. But it doesn't include birds. Why, Kevin?
Birds don't transmit tumah.
Exactly.
I don't know.
That's exactly it. Anything with feathers, etc., isn't considered to be involved with the contact of carrying it. Only if you eat a kosher bird that hasn't been shechted properly, you can contract tumah through digestion. But merely touching or carrying a bird, especially a non-kosher bird, isn't tameh at all. So it says then birds are not technically covered. So then if you steal my chicken, does that mean you don't have to pay the twofold payment? So we know that's not true. So then why does the Brisa state that it would include all things that are movable and have intrinsic value, which would include birds? In other words, the bottom line is why mention an ox, a donkey, a sheep? Because that seems now to be very specific to living creatures that contain tumah out of their carcass. So the Gemara says, look, you can say that. However, you've got a question. You've even got another question. The term garment. Does a garment seem like a moving article to you?
No.
No.
So then why would you pay a twofold payment and bring this thing of, we know you pay a twofold payment for a carcass, for a garment. But then why mention this issue of a carcass? Because it's now coming to generalize to non-living things. That's exactly the problem the Gemara says. So why wouldn't an animal be covered? Because the Gemara says, look, the reason it's written among other specifications is because one of the items mentioned in the specific statement is a garment. And that doesn't convey tumas, nevelos, it's not living. So the generalization, specification, generalization, which is trying to teach us to include similar items, includes all movable items of intrinsic value, even though the carcass transmits tumah through contact or carrying. So we're saying, like, what do we do with respect to the garment here? So they said in our question in the Gemara, we were talking about living things, and we meant as follows. So with regards to anything that's living in the list, it says that the category is that it has to transmit tumah through contact and carrying, but that which does not live, there's still a twofold payment, but then it doesn't have to have that issue. So now we still don't know why a bird is not included, because we know halachically that the bird is included. Because there's this, you can use another word, and there's a word, let me just see without skipping a gun. I tell you what, guys, let me not go onto the 63rd page. We're going to do this next time. Kevin has to get his bike. All right, guys, have a wonderful week. I'll see you please
Sure.
night. Thanks. Wish you
Travel
best.
safe, Kevin.
Thanks.
Travel
Thanks.
and return safe.
Bye.